a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Hey, everybody, welcome on this beautiful Sunday evening to the interview room. We're so grateful that each and every one of you are here. And always, we want to thank our subscribers because it is you and our Patreon members who keep this channel up and running. And for that, we are so grateful. If you're new with us, we only ask one thing, and that is please hit the subscribe button and hit that thumbs up and then share it on your social media platforms. That's all that the interview room ever asks for. And for that, we are, again, grateful. Thank you so much. So as always, we want to thank our mods, Miss Sophia, Teresa M, Maui Girl, and Mimi J2. You guys keep us going. Without you, we cannot do this show. And we love you and appreciate you very, very much. Tonight, as you can tell, we have an incredible show again lined up for you. We're talking about the Delphi case with Dr. Ann Burgess, Dr. Gary Brucato, and CourtTV's Barbara MacDonald, whose podcast, Down the Hill, is all about the Delphi case. And let me tell you something. I have listened to it, and if you want to know anything about this case, then Barbara is the authority on the Delphi case. And for that, we are grateful that she's here. So I'm going to run a little bio here on our guest. Those of you who know, out of respect, Dr. Ann Burgess, she is a renowned pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse, and is also one of the original behavior science folks in the behavior science unit with the FBI. As a forensic nurse, she is a legend, and she is just that, a legend. She's the author of A Killer by Design, Murderers, Mind Hunters, and My Quest to Decipher the Criminal Mind. And all of her books are going to be in a link below. So if you've not had a chance to get over to Amazon and pick it up, you're missing a great educational experience. Among her many awards and accolades, she was, in 2016, again, given the living legend of the American Academy of Nursing. And that, you can't get any higher than that. And for that, we love Ann. We're grateful that she's here. And I want to say hi and thank you for being here tonight, Ann. So grateful.
Thank you, Chris.
Down in the lower right corner is our other dear friend, Dr. Gary Brucato. He is a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess and Dr. Victor Petrecka on forensic research. They have examined crimes such as murder, including serial killings, serial offenses, mutilation, dismemberment, and the insanity defense. Gary and I don't get invited to a lot of dinner parties because of that particular situation, but he too is one of the most brilliant forensic minds that I've ever run across, and I'm grateful that he's currently serving as a consultant on a grant-funded project by Dr. Burgess and Petrecka, analyzing murders involving asphyxiation by strangulation and other means. He studies, among other things, how violent thoughts and actions emerge in psychotic and non-psychotic persons. And tonight is a perfect reason to have Dr. Brucato with us as well. Gary's the co-author of the Columbia University Mass Murder Database, which is the largest mass murder database in the world. He's also the co-author of The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime, where he has, along with Dr. Michael Stone, categorized 22 of the most violent personality types that commit these types of horrendous events. We have a link to his books as well. I didn't have it behind me. That's my bad, but I will get it up there as soon as I reach over and grab it here. So, and now our special guest, Mrs. or Miss? Mrs. Barbara MacDonald. And thank you so much for being here. Barbara MacDonald, she is an award-winning journalist and producer. She is currently a senior writer for CourtTV, so she gets to hang out with Vinnie Politano all the day long, and they get to see how things are going out there. But she's an amazing writer, and not only that, like I said a minute ago, she knows more about this case than I think a lot of people combined. She is the co-host and co-producer of Down the Hill, the Delphi Murder podcast, which has been downloaded more than 20 million times. Wow, 20 million times. She's also the co-producer and the reporter of and reported on the 2-hour special documentary in the same name, Down the Hill. Her work has been seen in Investigative Discovery and many other major news networks around the United States and the world. So she is the real deal, and we're so grateful to have her here tonight to give us some insight into the Delphi murder. So, Barbara, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation and amazing company. I am honored to be able to discuss this case with the expertise that is on this panel tonight. Absolutely amazing.
Thank you so much. And Gary, thank you for being here this evening. I forgot to welcome you.
That's quite all right, Chris. I know your warm regard for all of us. Oh, there you go. Look at that. Look at you with these the advertisements. You got to get Ann's book. You need Ann's book.
I didn't bring Ann's book. I've got it at the house. Ann, I'll bring your book next time, I promise, and I'll have it up behind me. And Barbara, do you have a book? Anyway, okay. So here's the ground rules for tonight. Okay, as always, we want to make sure that we keep inform, up front for all of those who've never been to our channel before. We consider ourselves a class act, so what we don't want to do is, hammer the victims and or the families in any way, shape, or form. If you want to use initials in the chat, feel free to do that. But don't, we're not here to, throw shade on anything or anybody. This is a kind of an educational, intellectual conversation about, the realities of what's going on here, because there are families that are suffering currently, and we want to be sensitive to them. So if you guys would do that for us, we would be grateful, and our mods would be grateful as well. We like to keep our chat classy. So let's first recap a couple of things. And I've got to set the stage, I put a little PowerPoint thing together. And I just want to point out that is a great picture. By the way, can you tell us about this particular picture, Ann?
That was, I believe, in February of 22. And I was out there doing some reporting for HLN, who I was working for at the time. And I had walked out to the bridge by myself that day. It was very cold, as you can see, a lot of snow on the ground, and was recording some promo videos for our special report. And it just really struck me to see the bridge. This was February, so it was around the same time of year that the girls were out there. However, when they went missing, there was no snow on the ground. So this was a very different look. It's a striking bridge, whether it's photographed with snow in the middle of summer, anytime. And when you go out there, you're just really struck by how high it is. It's 63 feet above the creek below. And it's just, it's impressive. I can understand the draw for people wanting to go out and take pictures to post to Instagram and do things like that, because it is so striking.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And here is your Down the Hill podcast. And what's interesting about this is Gary and I were talking, and Dr. Burgess, they came up with an idea in relationship to talking about another case that occurred in 1972, and that's going to be the Jeannette DePalma case. And we're going to get into that towards the end here. But, this case here with the most recent information that's been provided in some of the affidavits and documents. I wanted Dr. Brucato here and Dr. Burgess to talk about the psychological aspects of some of these, what we're seeing potentially. And so last week I did part one, which was the investigative approach. Okay, that's kind of, my thing, right? And so I wanted them here along with you so that you guys can have an open intellectual conversation. So let's set the ground rules or the foundation here, and let's talk a little bit about the victims. Barbara, what can you share with us about these two young little girls?
Well, on the right side of the screen, that's Libby. On the left side of that double photo, Abby on the right in that hat with the polka dot scarf going around it. They were best friends. Libby had just turned 14. Abby was 13. They were in 8th grade. I've talked to teachers who said that trying to keep them separated at school was always a bit of a problem. During the breaks between classes, you're supposed to be moving from one room to another. They would get together and be talking and would have to be reminded to go to their respective classes. They did share some sports. They were gearing up at the time they were murdered to play softball at school and had just gotten all of their equipment and were getting really excited to be part of that. Libby was also a swimmer. She played volleyball. Abby also played volleyball. They were normal 13, 14-year-old 8th grade girls. They had a large circle of friends. The fact that they were best friends didn't mean that they were exclusively together all the time. They had other friend groups, but they came together quite often. Abby spent a lot of time at Libby's house, as she had done the night before their murders. She spent the night there because they wanted to be together. They were up late making crafts, making videos, and doing things that typical girls that age do. The picture on the left of the screen is the last image that we know of Abby. It was one that Libby had taken as they were crossing the bridge that afternoon, Monday, February 13th of 2017. We believe it's Abby's first time crossing that bridge. You can see that she's looking down in the photo. The bridge is an abandoned railroad bridge. At the time, there had been no repairs to it. So the railroad ties had various levels of spacing between them. The ties were rotted and not full and complete. So it did require looking down at the bridge to cross it, to know where to put your feet. And that's what she appears to be doing in that image. Libby posted that to Snapchat, and that was the only way anybody knew where they had been just before they disappeared until the bodies were found.
So this is the last photograph of that's Libby on the left.
That's Abby. Well, on the right side, the double photo. Libby is
Right.
the blonde without the hat. Abby is wearing the hat. She's freckled with more strawberry colored hair.
Okay. And this is Abby on the bridge in the last photograph.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, Dr. Brucato, any thoughts or ideas while we're on this slide?
Well, I always look at the location. I mean, we always start with the victim, which I think has been very well described. And you always want to think of why were they targeted? Why did they become victims? What was going on? They certainly would be low risk. It doesn't look like, unless you would want to say that being out, this was not an area that, correct me if I'm wrong, it was any other crime had been committed there. It was just an area. So that they were, and I think the school was, they had a school day off, right?
Correct. It was a snow day that wasn't needed. So they had the day off.
Yeah. So they were just out doing, and being so sports minded, they were out walking rather than inside watching something. So it looks like low risk victims. And as you can see, there's nothing there. There's very, no, just trees and this bridge. So, yeah.
So Gary, what do you think?
Well, if I knew absolutely nothing about the case and we're looking at it the first time, what would start jumping out at me is that whoever did this would have a kind of unusual familiarity with a pretty odd place to know a lot about, all the crevices of it and so forth. So that I would immediately start thinking local, that this is somebody who's from the immediate. And would that also jump out at you that somebody would have to be pretty familiar with that peculiar place?
Absolutely. And the motive. I mean, you want to think what possibly could there be a motive? Is this someone that knew them? Probably not. Was just waiting for someone to come along.
And Barbara, what was your impression when you stood at that bridge, and you've had this image in your mind for quite some time? What struck you?
Well, it is fairly remote. I mean, Carroll County, where Delphi is located, is a county of only about 22,000 people. Delphi itself, the city, is only home to about 3,000. So you're talking about an area that is not well populated at all. However, where the bridge is located, even though it looks desolate in this particular photograph, there are farms not that far away. There are homes that sort of ring that area, for lack of a better phrasing. And so you're not completely out where, you're too far away from people. However, there are a lot of people in Delphi that I've talked to who weren't familiar with this bridge at all until this crime happened. It seemed to be popular more with the younger people, more the adrenaline junkies wanting to walk across it. I've talked to people who've ridden ATVs across it. I've seen a lot of Delphi locals who go out there to take photos, who go out there and take their prom pictures, go out during the winter and take pictures of the bridge covered in snow. So it is popular with certain groups. And then for the people who've lived around that immediate area, most of them owned their properties for decades. Some had been in the family for several generations. So you have people living around there who are intimately familiar with all of that land.
Interesting. So walk us into the girls are out there and what ends up happening.
So they go out, they're dropped off by Libby's older sister about 1:30 in the afternoon, and they're supposed to be picked up about 3:15. They don't show up. They don't respond to their father's. Libby's dad is calling, texting. Other family members start calling and texting. They're not responding. He gets there. He looks around a little bit. He immediately gets concerned, calls in other family. They all come out to the area. They immediately start looking for the girls. Nobody finds anything. So by about 4:30, people are getting very concerned. Police are called somewhere around 5. By 5:30, you've got a pretty extensive law enforcement response out there looking for these girls. The concern was, could they have fallen off the bridge? Could they be in the creek? Could they be injured? Could they have fallen down one of the steep hills, of which there are many, and broken a leg or an arm? And could they be in some sort of trouble that way? It wasn't until the next morning that their bodies were found, just before noon. There were several search parties out looking for them, and it was a private citizen in one of those organized searches that first discovered them, and immediately law enforcement was notified, and a huge response was immediate.
Barbara, can I ask you something? Barbara, do you know if there was any consideration of an Amber Alert?
There was not, because my understanding is for an Amber Alert, you need vehicle description. There needs to be some vehicle connection, and there was no information that they had gotten into a vehicle or left the area.
I'd always wondered why there wasn't an alert sent out like that.
Yeah, it did make news pretty quickly in the Delphi area because of Facebook and people calling one another. And as searchers went out and started knocking on doors of friends and neighbors to say, have you seen them, or where did you see them last? You know, it spread very quickly. And within no time, you had a huge group of local volunteers out there as well looking for the girls, in addition to the law enforcement.
So you had two active search parties taking place simultaneously. Were they coordinated together, or were they just randomly thrown together? And how did that come about?
My understanding is that there were efforts to keep things under control, but that it was challenging. There were a lot of people who just went out on their own to search. The fire department did try to keep a list and keep tabs on who was doing what. And the following day, things became much more organized. But that first night, I'm not sure how organized that was.
Okay, and that was the 13th of February. Was there snow or anything? Was it in
No,
the
weather
melt?
was
No?
good. The temperature, the 13th, when they disappeared, the high was about 46 degrees. It hadn't rained or snowed in a number of days. It wasn't particularly windy. You know, there was just really nothing going on in terms of Indiana at that time of year. The weather was really good. It got down that night, I believe, into the very, very low 40s or perhaps upper 30s. And then the next morning, the weather was similar. It was mostly sunny, clear skies.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, any thoughts?
Well, I was just wondering, that was there any information by the time the bodies are found about how long they had been? What was the timing on the murders?
No one has said anything officially, but most of the law enforcement sources that I've talked to all believe that the girls had passed pretty quickly after they were abducted. The abduction is believed to have begun at 2:13 p.m. because of the video that Libby captured on her phone. That's what time she was recording. It's a 42-second recording. And by 3:15, Libby's father is out at the trails looking for her, calling in other family. They're hollering their names. They're calling her phone. It's going straight to voicemail. There's just no sign of them.
Yeah. I was just wondering if it was very dark at night, whether this was how long they had kept the bodies, the persons, any of that. But it sounds like you think, because two girls, there's have to be, is it going to be one person or two? It's hard. They're 12, 13, 14. They're not small, but they're certainly would, for how they were controlled. You'd want to know how they were controlled, whether by a weapon, it sounds like.
Right. And that is something that the prosecution did put in some of their filings in the Richard Allen case, is that they believe that the suspect used a gun to get control of them. And that they allege in the video that Libby recorded of the suspect that one of the girls does say something about there being a gun.
Okay. So that was the method. And then gets them down with another area.
Right.
Up from the bridge. It sounds like there's a big drop. Is there a big drop?
Huge drops. Yes.
Huge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because where the bridge is, you're like 63 feet above the creek. And if you're over at the private property of Ron Logan, the property owner where they were found, the man whose picture is on the screen now, as well as the other farms there on that road just north of the bridge area, that's also about 60 feet above the creek.
So the girls are just found on Ron Logan's property. So he was the first to surface. Tell us what you can. Give us a high-level run through Ron Logan. What do we know about him?
77 at the time. He lived alone on the property. He had some horses, some pygmy goats, some chickens and rabbits and other animals. He had owned that property at that point for 55, 60 years. He was a local man. He'd been born and raised in Carroll County. His family is buried at the cemetery just north of the bridge, just east of his home, which is featured prominently on a lot of the maps of the immediate area where all this happened. He was retired at the time. He had not had a lot of run-ins with the law in terms of committing crimes. How well, other than he had a problem with drinking and driving. He had numerous DUIs that he had been in trouble for. He was on probation at the time the murders happened because of one of those DUIs. And he kind of surfaced because not only did he look in these news images, he did a lot of interviews immediately after this happened, took a lot of reporters down to the crime scene to show them the area once it had been cleared by law enforcement. And he appeared to be dressed similarly to what we knew about the suspect. A blue jacket, perhaps a hat with a hood over it, blue jeans. He was definitely familiar with the area. He admitted in some of those interviews that he had been out driving, and that was a violation of his probation. So he was taken to court over that. There were a lot of people who at the time believed he was the suspect and that this was the beginning of catching the suspect. He ultimately pled guilty to a probation violation for being out driving and got sentenced to about 2 years in prison. He went to a prison facility in Indiana where he told me that he had been housed with the worst offenders for this probation violation. He said they treated him as if he was the killer of these 2 girls. He got out after about a year. He was on house arrest. He passed away last year in January. He was 82 at that time, and he always believed that he was a suspect and that he never felt that law enforcement had officially cleared him. They certainly seemed to move on from him, but they have never, ever come out about him or anyone else and said that person is cleared.
Barbara, can I just ask a couple things? First of all, my understanding is that it was determined that Ron Logan had created a false alibi
Correct.
for himself at the time of the Delphi murders, claiming he was at an aquarium store.
Yes.
when that wasn't true. And secondly, what can you tell us about reports by previous romantic partners that I know are out there, that he was very misogynistic, violent with women, had perverse sexual interests, so forth, because this is all going to figure a great deal into the way we're going to talk about the kind of person who would commit Delphi.
Yeah, there's one of his former girlfriends has been pretty vocal on social media talking about her experience with Ron and him being violent towards her and being very physical with her. And she's not alone. I've spoken to other people who have been involved with him in intimate relationships who describe very similar behavior. However, there's nothing in his official record. He never got cited. There were no restraining orders against him that I could find, anything like that. However, there are women who describe him as being very quick to anger, being misogynistic, as you mentioned, being somebody who was very quick to hit or push. There was an incident with one woman that's cited in some of the documents from the FBI where he yanked her out of a vehicle by her hair, shoved her into the house. I've heard of him being very vindictive with some of these women, calling police on them, reporting them for things that he also did. For example, driving drunk, something that, he had been busted for at least 4 times that we know of. And he had an interesting response to me regarding some of those DUIs. In fact, regarding all of them, he always had a distinction that he was not drunk when he left the bar, that the police would follow him, and by the time he got home, he was drunk, and that's when they would pull him over. But that technically, when he was making the drive, he wasn't drunk. And he was very, very precise about that distinction.
Anything with underage girls? Any history?
Not that I can verify. He did have a girlfriend that was living with him months before Abby and Libby's murder. She had broken up with him about 2 months prior to the murders. And she had a daughter that my understanding was about middle school aged at the time. But I have also heard that the daughter was not living there, that she had the daughter, but the daughter was living elsewhere. While this woman was living with Ron.
Interesting.
And he seemed to have some perverse tastes in pornography also.
That's something that I never spoke to him about that, but that is something that several women that he had been involved with have reported.
Including things like bestiality and really the creepy stuff that suggested some paraphilic, abnormal sexual interests.
He was also a very physically strong man. I've heard stories, he was a horse person. He loved horses, owned horses over the years, rode horses, used to go on hunting trips where he would ride horses. And he, from my understanding, talking to people who've known him, that he used to be able to break horses, the old fashioned, the really rough way that they used to do it, where he would basically wrestle these wild horses to the ground to get control of them. And that I've heard a lot of stories about ways that he's treated perhaps some of his animals as not being perhaps as compassionate as one would hope somebody is with animals.
And Barbara, one other thing I just wanted to clarify. I hope you forgive the questions, but because of the work he did, how familiar would he have been with anatomy, at least of animals, when it came to things like cutting throats, understanding arteries, things like that? In other words, was he butchering animals?
He did. He told me that he butchered his own animals. He raised several animals so that he could butcher them. And rabbits, he had several breeds of chickens, several breeds of rabbits. He had pygmy goats. I've heard stories of him castrating animals in perhaps an old-fashioned way too, just grabbing them and cutting what needs to be cut, and perhaps not using any anesthetic or anything to provide comfort for the animal. I think a lot of people, because of the interviews he did, he sort of shuffled. He was dressed in a bit of a sloppy fashion for a lot of those interviews he did right after the murders. And I think a lot of people saw him as somebody who was perhaps frail and old, and he really wasn't. He was very mentally alert. He seemed very physically fit, even years after the murders happened.
And how much interaction did you have with him, Barbara?
I've interviewed him multiple times over the years. I first met him in 2019. At the time, he did not want to do an interview. He hated the media. Eventually, he did agree to talk to me on a couple of occasions. It started with when we were shooting the documentary for HLN. I had been asking him for years to just allow me onto your property so I can look at the crime scene myself. I wanted to see the area, and he would never allow that. And HLN had very strong rules about trespassing, and so it wasn't something I was able to just go walk on his land. And eventually he said, all right, fine. And he took our cameraman and myself down to the crime scene. The hill just from his house down to the crime scene is steep as well. And I struggled on the hill. He was there. He was 81, I believe, at the time. And he put his hand out. He was very steady. He helped me down the hill. He was very strong. When we went back up the hill, the same thing. He put his hand out, helped me, steadied me on my way up the hill. He had no trouble climbing that hill when I was with him. And again, he was about 81 at that time.
Interesting. So almost within 2 days, he was out doing interviews, and I see the picture on the left with one of the channels.
Yeah.
And then you try to get an interview with him, and he's resistant for how many years?
It was a while. I first started reaching out to him in very early 29. No, actually, it probably would have been about the middle of 2018. I first started reaching out to him. And the first time that he agreed to actually do an interview with me was the summer of 2021.
Okay. Dr. Burgess, any thoughts while we're on Logan here?
Well, that's why I'm just trying to see if there was any interest in underage girls, because you've got the 13 and 14-year-old that look, unless those were very young photos, that look their age. I mean, they don't look 20, 18 or 20. And it's his property. He was the first one there?
No, he wasn't home when the bodies were discovered. He was out.
Oh, is that where alibi comes in to tell apart?
Well, no. So the second day he was out shopping and came home, and the roadblocks were going up, and they told him he couldn't get access to his own property. He did not like that at all. Told them in no uncertain terms, "No, I'm going to my property." But yeah, he had been out shopping for several hours that morning. It was the day before that he had said, and the times that he gave changed in various interviews, but he left his house, according to him, the day before, the day the girls went missing, around 1:30 to 2:30, and went to the fish store, which was about 25-30 minutes away in Lafayette, Indiana, and that he was there for, in his estimation, about 2.5-3 hours purchasing fish, then returned home with his fish. And that's when he first became aware. He said that the girls had been reported missing. Somebody knocked on his door asking if they could search on his property. And he said, sure, go ahead. And he didn't know until that point what had been going on.
Okay. So is he, yeah, that's interesting. Has he ever become, he was a suspect by his own words at some time?
Yeah, and the FBI said, the FBI wrote a probable cause affidavit for a search of his home and said, we believe he is the killer of these girls and that evidence of such will be contained in his property. My understanding is the FBI did not carry out that search warrant, that it was the state and local police that did. So I'm not sure if the types of things that the FBI went in thinking they were going to look for, if any of those items were recovered. But he definitely seemed to fall off the radar of investigators. They looked at him very heavy in March and April following these murders in 2017. In April, he was sentenced for the probation violation. And then law enforcement never talked about him with regard to this case after that.
Okay. Interesting. So from your experience being with him, what was your takeaway? Would you still keep him in the, we'll call the circle. We'll just create this imaginary circle. And I've got 3 people that we're going to talk about tonight, but would you keep him in the circle from your experience?
I think so. He doesn't have an alibi for where he was at the time the girls went missing. The alibi that he gave was a lie.
Okay, so let's go on to number 2. The second guy who emerges is Kegan Klein. Did I pronounce his name correctly?
Yes, Kegan Klein.
So give us a little rundown on Kegan.
So Kegan is the man pictured on the upper right in the black T-shirt. The guy on the left taking the selfie is I forget his actual real name, but these were stolen images of a male model that Kegan Klein was using to create a fake social media profile that he called Anthony Shots. and Anthony Schatz was, at the very minimum, had communicated with Libby's social media, had at very minimum at least liked an image that she had posted, perhaps had made comments on some of her images. He says he is unaware if he was communicating with her in any other way. We have an interview that Indiana State Police did with him after he was arrested on some child pornography charges for creating that fake profile and using that to solicit nude images from 13, 14-year-old girls in the Delphi, Indiana area. He has now been sentenced and is in prison. But again, that was a case that Indiana State Police came out and said, we want to know about this profile. We want to know anybody who is interacting with it. We think that perhaps Libby was. And that also has sort of fallen by the wayside. He has gone through the judicial process on his charges. He was facing about 30 charges. I believe 5 of them had been dropped by the time he went to trial. And he's been sentenced, and no word about whether or not there's still a connection to the Delphi case with him or not.
And he had, I was just going to say, clarify, he had pornography of young girls.
Yes.
That was his website. Oh,
yes.
Okay.
He was using multiple phones to use this fake Anthony Schatz profile and communicate with girls, including some of Libby's friends. And at the very minimum, he liked an image that Libby had posted the night that Abby and Libby were missing. Libby's older sister was going through her social media. She saw this name, didn't recognize it as somebody she was familiar with. She and a friend contacted whoever had access to that account at that time, whether it was Kegan Klein or not. Kegan says he doesn't have any memory of this when I interviewed him. And he was asked, do you know where the girls are? And apparently he responded, no, I'm sure they'll turn up. And he says, he was unaware if he was communicating with her directly or not. But he did plead guilty to all of the child porn charges against him. So hard to know where he's telling the truth and where he's perhaps leaving some out,
Barbara, am I correct that although there was certainly interest in pornography involving children, that there's no instance that's known of him actually assaulting a child, certainly not killing a child? But that it was a fantasy-based kind of a perversion without actual assault.
He said to me in my interview with him that he never tried to meet any of the girls in real life. There was in his initial charges a solicitation charge, but I don't recall offhand if that was one of the charges that was dropped or one that he had pled guilty to. I believe it was one of the ones that was dropped. But he insisted that I just wanted these images, that I was just this coward hiding behind the social media, and I didn't have the guts to go meet them. I just wanted these images. But, there were claims from Indiana State Police when they were investigating him that this was connected to a much larger child porn ring. There were allegations that he was using this fake social media account and giving other men access to it. And so were those men perhaps trying to meet up with girls? There's a lot that's not known. We thought as his case went through the courts that these answers would become available, and they haven't yet. So
did he live near the area?
He lived about 45 minutes away. He was in Peru, Indiana. He claimed he had never really been to Delphi, wasn't a place he went often, didn't have any real known connections there.
Did he work? What was his age? Anything?
He was, but I believe about 24 at the time all of that was happening.
Yeah. Work?
He I don't believe he was working. I don't know if he was making any money off of any of these images that he was soliciting. He had worked, he had told me, in the weed industry in Las Vegas. He had been a weed delivery guy. He had been a bounty hunter, he said, never licensed or anything like that, but was doing that type of work, according to him.
Mm-hmm.
He's an interesting character. So didn't he have other family members too that were playing into the child pornography or CM?
He
realm?
indicated that he believed his father had access to his accounts because he would leave his accounts logged in on these devices that would be in the home he shared with his dad. But he said he wasn't aware of whether or not his father did access any of that.
Okay.
I would think if you're using this account, you're using it to message with girls, you're going to see if someone else is doing that. So a lot of gray there that, he has never faced any charges in connection with Delphi. And again, he's kind of dropped off the radar among law enforcement.
It's interesting that you mentioned there could be other characters utilizing this same. Is this a Snapchat? I'm assuming where the
I believe it was an
majority of the
Instagram
conversations-
account. There was also an account through a social media site that all the kids were using that, I'm sorry, at my age, I've forgotten now the name of it. But that there were, some of these social media apps that came about that allowed people to message with each other and share images. And it was through those types of accounts.
Okay. Gary, what are your thoughts on, tell us about this guy?
Well, I think it's important to understand that this guy really falls more into the type of paraphilic, sexually perverse person who is really passive interpersonally. He was not the type of person where we have a history consistent with going out and actually assaulting children, but was somebody who seemed to live kind of in a fantasy world more than actually going. But we don't know in ways in which he might have been predatory, making money in outrageous ways, so forth. But I think the leap from the kind of person who had the sexual interests that might link him to Delphi and having the violent history and the misogyny that you would expect to see in a person committed to Delphi, it has bothered me. It's sort of absent in his history. He seems to me to be much more of an odd, passive, interpersonally weird person. Barbara, and that's consistent, Barbara, with everything that you know.
Yeah.
Him.
That is very consistent. And, I've never discovered any deep connections that he would have to Delphi or to the bridge area. And it's always been my belief that the killer is somebody who had really good knowledge of that area, because where the bodies were found, about a quarter of a mile from where they were approached on the bridge, is really probably one of the better places to take somebody if you're trying to do something you don't want people to see. And to know that without having been there or spent a lot of time there, it doesn't strike me as the natural choice. There are a lot of areas where if you step off of the bridge and go in certain directions, you're not far from homes at all. And this was a deliberate effort to take them away from those homes. So my belief, it's somebody very intimately familiar with that area. And I've just never been able to uncover anything that says he has that knowledge.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, what's missing is that juxtaposition of perverse sexual interest and aggression that we see in the kind of offenders who commit certainly serial violent offenses against people, particularly children, in this case, and so that we don't have that bridge, so to speak, that is necessary between those things. But of course, you never know. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence of anything like that.
The only thing that makes me a little concerned is his access to other pedophiles or other persons interested in children, and if there was a ring, as is suggested, could other people did they did Libby's address, or was there any way that they could find somebody could find the girls? Or
I'm
was
not
it just
sure. All of those apps have location services that
Mhm.
you could turn on or off that would allow other people using the app or your friends using the app to see your location. I'm not positive if anybody would have been able to access
Yeah.
that of Libby's.
Yeah, and I would agree that one person like this trying to access and abduct two young teenagers would be hard unless he has this weapon. Any history that he had weapons or anything like that?
No, he didn't have
No.
any
Okay.
weapons charges related to these dozens of child pornography charges. He has told me that he carried guns in the past as part of his bounty hunting work.
He's a
But
bounty hunter.
he claimed that he did that type of work.
Mm.
But he also, I believe, is somebody who embellishes frequently.
Oh, okay.
Lives in a
Yeah,
fantasy world.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we're going to go on to number 3 here, and just the consensus. Would we keep him on the list to maybe kind of move him over to the right or to the left? Where would you put him? Anybody have any thoughts on that, or would you take him off?
I don't really believe that there is a connection with him. I think that, he perhaps liked this image on Libby's Facebook and perhaps communicated with her in another way, which is, of course, very coincidental given what happened to her. But I don't see the connection.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right,
I
so-
would echo that.
I
I've
agree.
come to believe that Klein is something of a red herring in this situation. Certainly disturbing factor, the interesting elements in his life, but I don't see him as connected to Delphi. I've never seen anything that impressed me that he was involved. But unfortunately, the media, the true crime community, so forth, sort of blew him up to be a more interesting character than he. But I think at the end of the day, he was a diversion from what was probably really going on. I'm curious how you guys, Ann and Chris, feel about it, but that's always been my sense.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I don't see him alone as being involved in it. It's the bigger network if there's anyone, and he doesn't seem the type that's going to be able to act to. From what you say, somebody had to abduct them and take them a fair distance from the bridge.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I agree with that. With the fact that he's insecure, and he's got that personality type of a wannabe, bounty hunter / whatever he's going to be. I think the geographic profile in this thing would be also difficult for him to navigate those hills in relationship to maintaining his fantasy control. So I would keep him way over here, but I wouldn't have spent a lot of time on him either. Okay, so number 3, Mr. Richard Allen, who is currently in custody, and the picture up above to the left is a recent one where they're saying his mental deterioration is occurring, to the picture to the right, and then his booking photo. So what can you tell us, Barbara, about Mr. Allen?
So he came on the scene quite suddenly in October of last year. The police announced that they had made an arrest. There was a big press conference. Everyone showed up. They said Richard M. Allen has been arrested and charged with 2 counts of felony murder. Nobody had really heard of this guy. This was not somebody that had been discussed in any of the many, many, many groups that are available online on Reddit or Facebook or any number of other platforms where people discuss this case. He was a manager of the local CVS store, which is right as you enter town. He had been in the community for many years, was married, had been married, still, I believe is married, has been married over 30 years, has an adult daughter. I spoke with his neighbors. He was a quiet man. The house never had a lot of parties, nothing really much going on. The neighbors all knew that he worked at CVS, said he lived a very quiet life. They'd see him come home from work in the evenings, sit out in the driveway, have a beer or two, have a cigarette or two. And that was pretty much it. And the way that he came on the radar, my understanding is about, I guess, middle of 2022, Indiana State Police brought in a cold case investigator and said, start from the beginning, go through everything. He found something in the notes that said this man had admitted he had been out at the bridge that day, looked for the follow-up, wasn't there. So they went out and talked to him again. He talked to law enforcement in October of 2022 and said, yeah, I was out there. I was wearing a blue jacket and jeans, which is what the suspect was wearing, but also what a lot of people in Indiana wear that time of year. He said he just went for a walk in the middle of the day, walked out to the bridge to look at the fish. He said he was using his phone and looking at his stock prices, I believe. And they got a search warrant for his property. They found a Sig Sauer pistol in his home that they say matches the ejection marks on a .40 caliber unspent shell that was found at the crime scene between the two bodies. And that was a bit of evidence that I had known about that unspent shell, but it had not been known by the general public that that was a piece of evidence that investigators were looking at. Many of my sources told me that no one really knew if that unspent shell came from the suspect or even came from law enforcement, because it's the same caliber that, from my understanding, a lot of law enforcement uses. So was it somebody who was part of the search effort for the girls? Was it one of the first responders who helped to recover them? Or is it linked to him? He was taken into custody around the 28th of October of last year. And he's been appointed 2 public defenders. It probably is a death penalty case. They say he's deteriorating significantly because of his treatment. He's being held in a prison, which, when you're arrested, you should be held in the county jail in Carroll County until you are tried. And then if convicted, then you go to prison. They're saying this is cruel and unusual punishment. He's being treated way too harshly. They're saying that now that there's actual evidence that law enforcement ignored for many years of this Nordic Odinist white nationalist group that perhaps is the real killers of the girls, and that some of the guards that are guarding him in the prison are members of this group, and that he is being tortured. The prosecution has said that he's confessed multiple times on the phone from prison in calls to his wife and his mother. His defense says that's because these Odinist guards told him that he had to confess or they would kill his wife and daughter. So there's a lot going on there with him.
Interesting. Gary?
Well, I just want to remind the viewers of your program, Chris, that Dr. Burgess and I have been on before. And one of the things that we've, about this case, and one of the things we've talked about is that they're really beyond an evaluation for medication and so forth, hasn't really been, certainly to my knowledge, any appropriate evaluation of the mental state of this man. For example, you have somebody who claimed he was present at the bridge and then it couldn't be corroborated. And then they went and talked to him again and he's insisting that he's there. And, so this is the same person who's insinuating himself into Delphi that he did this. Now, here's just as a simple example of something that bothers me, the kind of little inconsistency that bothers me in that Columbo kind of way, that keeps me up at night, that doesn't make sense, is that the kind of person who committed Delphi clearly has an issue with women. Now, the confession that he's allegedly making is to his wife that he's had, who was a sweetheart of his from school. They've been together for decades, no problems in the marriage at all, adores her, she adores him. She's never, she supports him as has been said in the comments. There's been no wavering in her support of him. And to his mother. Now, he's confiding in his mother and his wife. He has positive relationships, trusting relationships with his mother and his wife. That is puzzling to me as a mismatch in the life of a person who would be misogynistic enough to go out and butcher 2 young girls. It doesn't match. And there's nothing in his history consistent with that kind of thing. So I'm very concerned about, I want to know if this guy has a history suggestive of something that would make him sort of psychotic or delusional, something that might make him confess to something where you can't actually situate him in the scene. And until that evaluation is done, I'm just reserving judgment. Because the other thing is that we're going to have to get into this is, the degree of organization and things like that. That would be a mismatch if this guy turns out, to be someone with a mental illness. We also know that in jail, he was doing things like, breaking the tablet, eating paper, getting disorganized, and so forth, so that, people might say, okay, maybe he's a malingerer, maybe he's faking it. Okay, except that there's nothing in this guy's history consistent with being a lying, malingering psychopath. It just doesn't make any sense. So, one of the things I was hoping Barbara could do is help flesh out, validate this sense that I've had. I hope I'm right, that there's nothing in this guy's history suggesting that he's a psychopath, and there's nothing in his history, suggesting that he hates women.
No.
So, I mean, have you heard anything at all that would corroborate that?
No, and I've talked to numerous locals who, the CVS is the only drugstore in town. There's no other place to go get your prescriptions filled or get, your photos printed. And so many people are in there often, including the former sheriff, Tobe Lesenby, was in there often. And everyone described him as being helpful and friendly. His neighbors described him as being very quiet, but very friendly. They never had any issues. He wasn't a jerk to them. I haven't heard any stories of people describing him as a narcissist or a jerk or anything like that. Everybody that I've talked to who encountered him in any way described him as being very friendly and very nice and very helpful. The other thing that's interesting to note is in the CVS, on the door on the way into CVS, they had the flyer for this unsolved double murder, and it had the sketches on it. Back in the pharmacy where he also worked behind the counter, they have the flyers on display taped up on the wall of, each section of the pharmacy. So he's in there all the time. These sketches are right there next to his head. The sheriff and other members of law enforcement are in there. Members of Abby and Libby's family are in there. And nobody, from what I understand, ever said, that's the guy.
And just the 2 other quick points. One is that I know of nothing that suggests that Alan would have a perverse interest in children, a sexual interest in children. I've heard nothing to that in that direction.
Same.
And the other thing is, very good. And the other thing is, you're talking about the way people felt in the presence of Alan. I have heard that Logan was somebody that was very off-putting and creepy and could be very condescending to women and so forth. A lot more of what you would expect in the presence of the kind of person who would do something like this. I mean, I was curious when we were talking about Logan, that didn't come up, but what did it feel like as a female to be in the presence of Ron Logan?
He intimidated me. The first time I went to talk to him, I in my mind, I knew that he could be the guy, but I kind of, I guess, felt that sense of security from law enforcement that seemed to be ignoring him, that he must not be the guy. But I was very much struck by his intelligence. Ron Logan was a very, very intelligent man. He had a very high IQ. He liked to learn. He liked to study things. He had a smartphone. He said he Googled things all the time. Just if he was curious about something, he would just start Googling it and reading about it. And he was very physically imposing. He was a very strong and capable man physically. even into his 80s, that surprised me, because the first time I met him from a distance. He wouldn't come to the end of his driveway. Once he found out I was media, he told me he didn't have any interest in talking to me. And at that time, I did kind of think he was a more feeble, frail man, given his age. But the more I encountered him and talked with him, I realized that wasn't the case. He was very physically strong and mentally strong.
Did he have any knowledge about people claiming this was an Odinist thing? Like, did he ever say, "Gee, this, not only were there murders on my property, but there were witchy, there was something culty about them"? I mean, did he have any opinion on that?
No. He didn't. He felt very much that the law enforcement of Carroll County was trying to railroad him and pin everything on him. Even after publicly it appeared that they had moved on from him, he felt that they were still trying to pin it on him. And it's interesting. I think Dr. Burgess made a comment earlier about all the television interviews he did in the very beginning, and then he stopped. And I think part of that might have been because of his son. He told me that his son said to him, "Your mouth is going to get you arrested for murder if you keep talking. You need to stop talking." And there did come a time where he stopped doing all interviews. My understanding is he was not cooperative with law enforcement either when they wanted to question him about what he knew and where he was.
That's
Interesting.
fascinating, and I'm hoping we'll get now into the question of where did this idea of Odinism come from? I mean, did the initial people who discovered this scene immediately say, "Boy, it looks like something culty happened here,"
Well,
or
before we get
is
to
that like
that,
a
Gary.
post hoc? Oh, okay, yeah, because
No, yeah, but
that stuff is
I want to
weird.
hear Ann, Dr. Burgess,
Oh, yeah,
weigh
sure.
in on Alan here and some
On
thoughts.
Alan, yeah, the way it's described, it just doesn't, unless we're missing some piece of something. I still go back to, you've got one man that perhaps using a gun is able to abduct these two young teenagers all the way a fair distance and then murders them all by himself. And we're supposed to think that this is a sexual homicide type. We don't even know that yet, right? Or do we? We don't know. So the motive for this Richard Allen is, where is it? So it's pushing me away from him, given everything that's been said.
Yeah, and he doesn't have any criminal history. I have not talked to anybody who talks about anything that he's done that would have gotten him in trouble with the law. There's nothing on his record. And he literally came out of nowhere. Before law enforcement had announced that he was arrested and that they had made an arrest and were going to do a press conference, I had gotten word from one of my sources that somebody was in custody. And I called one of Libby's family members and said, "What do you know?" And she said, "This man, Richard Allen, has been arrested and charged." And I said, "Who is this guy?" And she said, "We don't know. Like, this is a new name for us too." So he literally came out of nowhere when he was arrested and charged.
Yeah, I mean, and this is someone that whoever did this had to have been very familiar with the location.
He did live in the area. He was a hunter and fisher, so perhaps he was familiar. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of him spending a lot of time in that area, but he did tell law enforcement at least twice that he was out there that day around the time. There's some dispute about whether he said he was there from 12 to 1:30 or 1:30 to 3:30. The 1:30 to 3:30 would be problematic because it's believed the girls were abducted at 2:13. Where his house is located, he is south east of the bridge area where all this happened. But my understanding is that, let's say he is the guy who did this and he commits this crime and he's now covered in blood and needs to get out of there. Yes, there are witnesses who supposedly saw him walking on the road back to the abandoned CPS building where perhaps his car was parked, but he also could have walked home. There is a pretty lengthy route. He could have traveled about 3 to 4 miles largely in the wood line. So perhaps he could have gotten home in a concealed way and been able to clean himself up.
Have you seen his confession? Supposedly he confessed. What did he
No,
say?
no, and there's nothing known about it other than it was multiple times on the phone with the wife and with the mother. We don't know if that's one conversation, 5, 6 conversations. We don't know. We don't know if he offered any information during those confessions that only the killer would know, that,
Yeah.
law enforcement could then prove, yes, you're the guy because only the killer knows this and you just said it. We assume that these calls were recorded, as most prison phone calls are. Perhaps during his trial, we would get to see that and see and hear exactly what he says.
Okay.
So,
And just to Chris, I just want to add to Ann's question there, that I think the notion of this being sexual homicide is associated with the idea that Libby was found naked, and there had been some clothing transfer. I mean, Abby is wearing the wrong clothes, so forth. In other words, there's a nudity component that gives rise to the notion that this would have been possibly sexual in nature. But I also understand that there's no evidence of actual SA.
That's my understanding as well. Yeah.
Right. But Chris, that's your understanding also, right? That the sexual component comes from the nudity.
Yeah, and this is, you read my mind, Gary, because that's exactly where I was going to go in terms of with the confusion in terms of the suspectology here, right? The 3 different personality types. So then from an investigative aspect, obviously, the first couple of questions that we need to, if you can share some interesting points, Barbara, is, how there's a question of whether or not, both girls are, one girl is wearing, Abby's wearing Libby's clothes. She's, not dressed. I saw some pictures online while preparing for this that somebody had leaked some photographs of some shoes, a sock. Are those valid, or is that just stuff that's just bogus and it's out there?
I'm not sure if I've seen the photos you're referring to. I know there was somebody shopping around some images supposedly of the clothing in the creek. I don't know if those I don't know if those are authentic. I would think it would be pretty easy to recreate something similar. But I don't know that those are accurate.
So we'll leave that over here. And so then let's talk about, factual information that we know about how the victims were discovered. And then I want to get back to Dr. Brucato's point about how did we get into this, cult conversation and where did that originate? So tell us about what you can about the crime scene and stuff.
So the girls were found about a quarter of a mile away from where they were abducted on the bridge. They were led down a steep hill and across some flat land, across the creek, which I've crossed it myself. There are ways, if you know how to cross that creek, you can cross that creek without getting very wet. The photo in the upper right, you see 2 red figures in the creek. Those were searchers after the bodies were found. And there are parts of the creek that are 3 to, I think, perhaps 5 feet deep in areas. However, where I believe and where most people believe they did cross the creek, where they would have come out on that trail, there is a way to get across the creek. And many of the people who've lived around there and spent time there have all told me, yeah, absolutely. If you know what you're doing, you can cross it. And you might get your feet a little bit wet, but you're not going to get drenched.
So the locals told you?
Yes.
Most of the local people told you how to cross that creek?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah. And Ron Logan told me that as well. That was his land that came down to the edge of the creek there. And he had many horses over the years, and he used to ride his horses down and across the creek there too. He also used to have an issue with his horses getting out and going that way on their own, and he would go track them down and bring them back. But they were found in an area that it's kind of tough for me to describe, but it's some feet above the creek, but still significantly below, say, the bridge level or the level where Ron Logan's home was. They were in an area that was kind of indented a bit. So if you're laying on the ground and somebody's walking along the edge of the creek, they may not see you at all. They would have to come up over the berm. The photo where the man is standing, I think, represents the rough area where it's believed they likely exited the creek area and got up into where they were ultimately found. The area is spongy. It's an area that floods several times a year. There's many, many layers of dead leaves and branches. It's not flat. It's not clear at all. There's a lot of debris in that area. And it was searchers that found the bodies there. Libby, as you mentioned, was found nude. Abby was wearing the clothes that Libby had been wearing that day. There were 2 clothing items missing. The other clothing items were all found in the creek. And I've heard from various sources, some don't believe that the 2 missing items were actually taken. They believe they might have just not been recovered. Some believe they were actually taken perhaps as souvenirs or what have you. There were some sticks and branches on top of both bodies. And from many of the people that I've talked to who were at the scene while the bodies were still there, they did not believe, first looking at it, that this was intentional or meant to be some sort of a message, like these Nordic runes, as is alleged by the defense. They believed that the bodies were in the process of somebody trying to cover them, and perhaps that person got interrupted and had to leave so that they're not caught there. But there were large branches, not particularly thick in diameter, but longer than the bodies, that were on top of the bodies, perhaps in some sort of a symbol.
Okay, before we get there, may I ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
Okay, so let's talk about the clothing, first of all. Was Abby's clothing underneath Libby's clothing, or was Libby's clothing underneath Abby's?
According to the document filed by the defense, Abby was wearing 2 bras. One was believed to be hers. It's not clear if the second one was Libby's or one that was at the scene, or perhaps she was wearing 2 that day. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I've never heard of that, but she was wearing one that was described as a traditional bra and one that was more of a sports bra. She was wearing a red tank top that she had been seen in that photo that we saw earlier of her on the bridge. It was her mother's shirt she had been wearing that weekend. And she had Libby's jeans on and Libby's black hoodie that it's not clear why she was dressed in Libby's clothes. It's possible, I suppose, that if you are dressing a body, Libby's clothes were larger. Libby was bigger than Abby was. And so perhaps it was easier to put on the larger clothing onto a body. I don't know. I've never heard anybody give an explanation for why they believe that to be the case, but that was the case.
Okay, so the defense, go ahead, Ann. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say I have seen cases where a person will control kids, and they'd have them do fantasy kinds of things and then get undressed and then redress. And that could have been, if the fantasy is being played out, that could be one reason. Or putting the other clothing on. I mean, it's again rather perverse, but something like that could be. And then they're killed after they have done that. I've seen actually 2 cases like that.
That's exactly where I was going to go, Dr. Burgess. I think, meaning, you know 1,000 more things than I'll ever know about it. But and before Gary weighs in here, I just want to kind of lay out from an investigative aspect. If there's a gun involved, i.e., one of the girls says gun, and it's on that tape, so that's the control mechanism. Right. And if he's in this fantasy, he's playing it out, and it's a voyeurism situation. I would submit perhaps as a thought here, and I want to get what you guys think about it, is that he's controlling them with the gun and strips them both.
Right.
Gets at least gets them down to their shoes or wherever, gets them naked. He's processing the fantasy. I think he's in a voyeurism role here, and he's also kicking off some of the other, situations that's going on, because if there's no SA to the children, then at some point he's got to expel that fuel. And then as part of a dehumanization of Libby, he has Abby redress and then, plays on top of that her her jeans and her hoodie. And then I think that's when he strikes. And I think he strikes Abby first, and Libby is witnessing it naked because he's now got total control over this poor child. That's just my initial thought process. What do you think, Dr. Brucato?
Okay.
Or
well, I was just going to quickly say I would agree with that, because you're doubly vulnerable if you don't have your clothes. I mean, we've seen that before. So he really, and he's getting whatever he's ordering, he's running his little fantasy. That certainly makes sense. Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, and one other thing. I'm sorry, Gary, before you, because I know you're going to take off here. Folks
Not
are saying
really,
there's
just a couple of sentences.
but folks are saying there's no blood on Abby's clothes. Okay, that is not unusual. Specifically, if there's a neck wound and the body is positioned at a certain point. My question is there blood in her hair? Because if there's blood in her hair and she was removed, that means there's not going to be, and I've seen many cases, I've worked over 300 murders in my career. I've seen many cases where that blood transfer, depends on how the body is moved, doesn't get on those clothes. Okay? We've seen a lot of it. So that's not going to be a problem for me. But so, Dr. Brucato, you're on.
Well, and I first of all, I want to remind everyone that in the original documentation, the original affidavit, what it says is that their interpretation was that the bodies had been, quote, moved and staged. I thought when I read that this implied that there was a mismatch between where blood was on the ground and where these bodies were found, because they were able to determine that there must have been some dragging or moving of at least one of them. And now that we know about this so-called, Odinist stuff, it is very interesting that the word staged was used, because it makes me wonder if whatever it is that they found, the initial interpretation was somebody is trying to make this look different than what really happened here, which is, of course, what staged means. I wondered from the beginning. I remember I appeared on another podcast and I slipped up and used the word posed and got a lot of heat for it. But I wonder if on some level, this didn't happen, because part of me wonders if the investigators didn't mean posed when they said, that this was a psychosexual fantasy or something being played out. So I think it's important for the audience here to understand the difference, the important distinction between staged and posed. So the other thing that bothers me is that, we seem to be forgetting that there was an assumption that whatever was done there was laid out to give an impression that was different than what it is that happened. So one of the things I was hoping Barbara can explain, because it's bothering me, is how long did it take people to come up with this Odinist idea? When did it first emerge? Did they say it immediately, or did it take weeks, for people to wonder about that?
I don't know exactly. Obviously, there were photographs done at the scene of these sticks on the bodies, but the sticks were not collected as evidence. My understanding from multiple investigators who were there in those early days, that there wasn't a belief that they were significant. obviously they did photograph them, and at some point several weeks into the investigation, they did ponder, is this something significant? Are the arrangement of these branches some sort of message or code or symbol? And people were consulted. But I have sources who are critical of the investigation, who still tell me to this day that there's nothing to this religious Odinism, sacrificial ritual killing, that they believe these things were done to make it look like something it was not. Or perhaps an abandoned effort to just conceal the bodies. I've also talked to people who say, you know, we don't often think about how many times branches just fall off trees in the woods. How many of these were branches that simply fell onto the bodies in the potentially 18 to 20 hours that they laid there before they were discovered?
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
And when
I
were
mean,
they
we have
found?
to oh, go ahead, Chris, please.
When were they found, Barbara?
So they
I
went
forget.
missing sometime after 2:13 on Monday, and they were found before noon on Tuesday. Sometime, I believe, close to 11 a.m. when they were actually sighted, and then everything kicked into high gear.
Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Brucato. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say one of the things that really bugged me in the Franks document was that this statement is made that I think it was at least one of the sticks was so smoothly cut that it raised the question of whether there was access to like an electric saw. And this bothered me because if that were accurate, I mean, imagine what's being implied by this. Either somebody preparing for a ritual, like even on the bridge, would have these sticks tucked away somewhere or pre-prepared at the scene, or they had access to an electric saw that, you know, on the property or had it hidden in the clothes. You know, what that bothered me because, you know, I don't know how corroborated that is. I mean, is it from what you're hearing, Barbara, is it more likely that they were just broken off? Or is there evidence that you're aware of this smooth, meticulous cutting of the branches?
Yeah, other than that defense document, I had not ever heard that any of them were sawed. That it was just branches that perhaps were already on the ground that appeared to be collected and put on top of the bodies.
Well, the reason it's so fascinating to me is that it would speak to a very different degree of organization. I mean, somebody who had a ritual laid out to the point of needing to carefully, meticulously sever branches to use in a ritual is very different than somebody who just snaps some twigs off and lays them out randomly in a idiosyncratic manner. So I was very interested in that. And the other thing is we have to remember with this whole Odinism thing, is that a ritual, by definition, has to be done a very specific way. The whole point is you would need people laid out in a particular way with very particular instruments and very particular process, you know, and so that the chaos of this scene bothers me that it's being described as a ritual. And you know, one of the things I want to understand is there a guidebook somewhere or are there rules somewhere about the ritual? How does it have to be done? Or is it just something where like you do it any way you want, you know, in a sort of paganistic way where, you know, so I'm bothered by that. And it sounds like what you're hearing is not suggestive of bringing, you know, prepared sticks or having a saw or anything like that. It almost
Right.
sounds silly to,
No, and that you know, the theory laid out by the defense in that memo seems to involve multiple people. Makes the argument that Richard Allen alone could not have committed these murders, that what happened at the crime scene would have required more than one person to be involved. And that's been debatable from the beginning as well. And many of my sources do believe that it is one person that is responsible for this murder and not more than one directly involved in the murder. Perhaps somebody helped after the fact, but most of my sources believe it is one actor involved.
and also what's peculiar to me is why would there be a sexualized component then? Was that just an afterthought, an afterthought in a ritualistic killing? The other thing that I don't understand about it is, why would white nationalists sacrifice two white victims? I mean, is the idea to reduce the number of white people in the world? Isn't the point supposed to be that they want to eliminate people that are not white? It just sort of confuses me.
Mhm.
I one of the things I'm very excited about is that we're going to be talking about a case tonight that that has a lot of parallels to Delphi, and I think it becomes very instructive in terms of why it's very dangerous to go down the route of occult interpretation. Basically, take the focus off of a sexual homicide interpretation. And so Chris, you let me know when you want to switch over to that case,
Well,
but I have
yeah,
a lot to say
but
here. Yes.
I want to hear Dr. Burgess have her weigh
Absolutely.
in on the scene and from what we're hearing here, it sounds like, Libby is nude.
Right.
Abby is in the clothing, pants, and a pullover jumpsuit, or what do you call that, a hoodie,
Mhm.
and then
Whose clothes are those, though?
Abby is wearing Libby's clothing when she's found.
well, two items though, just two
Yeah,
items,
just the
right? 'Cause
jeans and the hoodie. The undergarments were her own.
okay,
Yeah.
and so what do we know? What's missing?
A pair of underwear and a sock is my
And
understanding of what's missing.
is that's then Libby's?
I have not heard definitively who those items belong to,
Okay.
but that is what was missing.
Okay, Dr. Burgess, thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are, when you have two victims, has one been targeted more than the other? Always want to think about that. And as one received more than the other, we've already got some of that. There is one child is nude and the other not. And what does that mean? I still think that there's some fantasy being acted out. But going back to what you have on the screen, Barbara, am I seeing that that's the way they're found? The bodies are found?
Yeah, but my understanding looking at the scene is that this appears to be a depiction of Libby on the left and Abby on the right, based off of the description in this 136-page memo from the defense. That is how they described the crime scene. But my understanding is Abby, rather, the figure on the right, actually was to the left of Libby. And Libby's got one arm up and is touching the tree where this, according to the defense memo, a rune is drawn in Libby's blood on the tree. You can see the impression to the right of this image. That is from some of my law enforcement sources telling me that is a representation of what that image on the tree looked like. And they did not describe it to me as being a letter or something drawn. They thought that perhaps it was a handprint, partial handprint, perhaps a bloody part of the suspect brushed up or leaned up against the tree and made the marking that way. I had not heard from my sources that it was confirmed to be Libby's blood, but that is a detail that is contained in that defense document.
Yeah, so that becomes, having to interpret all of that is important, especially that it's blood, because you're certainly going to be able to tell whose blood it is. I would hope they'd be able to test it. Is there any chance it would be any of the killer? Possible?
My understanding is the swabs that were done came back as being positive for Libby only. However, like with the sticks that were not collected in the initial crime scene collection, the tree was not collected, nor was the bark. It was just left there.
And is the figure immediately close to that, has her hands being up against her chest? Does that sound right?
No, so the figure of Abby that is pictured here on the right is actually over on the left. And yes, that's how the defense described it in the memo, is that her hands were up and onto her body.
Right. And no binding, no ligature, nothing like that. Do we?
Not that I'm aware of, and not that has been contained in any of the documents that have been released so far.
And are we saying that it's a blade that is a knife that is the weapon?
A sharp-edged weapon.
For
yeah.
both
girls had injuries to their necks.
And
So-
just to point something important out, according to the Franks document, it goes out of its way to say that Abby, it took a long time to die, that it would have been
It was a slow
suffering,
death.
right.
And there've been rumors and speculation for a long time that perhaps she survived many hours after. Most of my sources all believe that, based on her injury, that her death was much, much quicker than that, based on their injuries, that perhaps both would have passed within a minute or two of the injury being inflicted.
So
Did
this
either,
It's very interesting.
Did either of them have their phones? Or were their
Libby had her phone. That's how we got the picture of the suspect and the video of
yeah.
him and the words of him saying, "Guys," and "down the hill."
where
The
was
phone
the
was
phone?
found at the crime scene under one of the girls. I had always heard it was Libby, but the defense document says, I believe, that it was found under Abby.
And do we know if there are any photos on there that they haven't?
All that we're aware of is that Libby had captured this one video, 42 seconds in duration, that started right at 2:13 and captured the suspect walking behind them on the bridge and ordering them down the hill.
Okay.
So just thinking through this, listening to you, it sounds like there's a possibility that the neck is the point of majority of the injury. And what I'm seeing in that F thing is not, anything that is created. That looks to me to be arterial spray, and that she's very close to that tree. And when it goes down, because I've seen this pattern before, not the F thing, but the heavy blood spatter coming out. That's the initial arterial spray with the heart beating, and it's pushing the blood. And as the blood starts to dissipate, you start getting thinner and thinner lines going through this. I think it's interesting that they have a picture of Abby with her hair above her head. And that was the question I had earlier about where is her hair positioned? Because if she also has a neck wound, I've seen neck wounds that potentially could bleed internally rather quickly if depends on what type of weapon is used. And I'm not going to speculate on the type of weapon used, but that could also, she can bleed out pretty quickly inside. And that would also help us understand potentially why the blood is not necessarily on her exterior clothing. And I'm thinking out loud here, but the staging aspect of this, I'm having a difficult time, and I don't know about you guys, so keep me going here. I'm having a difficult time of a group of people, taking the time to go through all these mechanics of, hey, we've got to put the branches here, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, and and then it's part of a ritual to what Gary was talking about. And Dr. Burgess, back in the day, remind me about the satanic ritual work that you guys did in the BAU.
Oh, right. Well, in those days, it was all the daycare cases, the St. Martin's case. There was the West Point case. There are a number of alleged rituals being carried out on little children in daycare settings. And I was trying to think about that in terms of this. You've still got children to some degree, 12, 13, 14, but much of what was done back with the daycare children was to threaten and to get them so frightened and so scared it was their kind of muted torture, if you will. And think of it with these two young girls, that it's February and it's cold and they have to take their clothes off. I mean, is horrible what what went through. I still think that I agree with you that I don't see a group of people being able to do this or carrying it out. The any ritualistic thing. I think Gary has said that, and Chris, but that's my agreement is a group wouldn't be able to do that. It doesn't look that organized or what's going on. So I dismiss that at one at the most two that are carrying out some very, very sadistic kinds of acts on these two young gals.
Barbara, what's your impression?
You know, I think that unfortunately in this case, so much of the evidence is vague, and that lends people from different perspectives and different experiences to say it's clearly this or it's clearly that, when we don't know yet. The picture is still quite fuzzy of what exactly happened out there that day, and what does it all mean? How much of it is intentional? How much of it is random? Could it have been just one person who watches a lot of crime shows saying, I'm going to make this look like, you know, something very sensational, when it is much simpler than that?
Yeah, you know, in my career, I remember going to school with Mary Ellen O'Toole, and she did a class on satanic rituals and cults and et cetera. Because back in 1989, I had a case with Leticia Hernandez, who was a 6-year-old, and there were so many rumors about that she, when we finally found some of her clothing, and unfortunately only, you know, identity parts that, or parts that we could identify, but there was all this rumor going around about, you know, this satanic cult, you know, she was sacrificed and all this other stuff, kind of like what's going on here. And when I was talking to Dr. Brucato about that, he immediately said, you know, Janette DePalma. And so this is the case of Janette DePalma, and I'm going to give Dr. Brucato, because you're going to find this really fascinating here. All right, Doc, you're up.
All right. Well, yeah, this case has fascinated me for a while, and I had it in my, you know, listen, I keep spreadsheets of different homicides and other offenses precisely because I want to be able to rapidly search them when something goes on, so that I can find instructive cases that might have parallels. And this case, this DePalma case, which has bothered me for a long time, is one that has an enormous number of parallels with Delphi, and I think is just a great learning case for us to talk about. So let me lay out what's known about it and how interpretation of it as having cult elements became an enormous problem, and I think ultimately led to it going cold. So here is what is known about this. So this case involves a girl who was 16 years old. She had actually turned 16 4 days before she vanished on August 7th of 1972. And that was in New Jersey, Springfield, New Jersey. She came from a remarkably low crime area. And she was one of 5 girls and 3 boys being raised by Pentecostal Italian parents, very, very religious. And this girl had aspirations of going to a Bible college, and was doing a lot of going around to her friends in school, telling them that behaviors of theirs were sinful, and they needed to convert. She was very particularly concerned about people using illicit substances, drugs, things like that. And what happens is she tells her family on that August 7th date. She tells their parents that she's going to go out to see a friend and she's going to take a train. But it turns out she never takes the train. She vanishes. There was some speculation that maybe she wasn't honest, that she was really going to hitchhike because she thought her parents might be very worried about her hitchhiking, but she was really not the type to be dishonest about anything. She was sort of meticulous about feeling guilty, and that everything was a sin, all that kind of stuff. And what happens is she vanishes. Now, on September 19th, this very disturbing incident happens where a woman is walking her dog, and the dog brings a forearm and a hand, a right forearm and a hand from a body. One of the little details that I think really adds to the horror of the scene is that the fingernails are painted. So there's this hand with painted fingernails and arm in the mouth of this dog that brings it to her lawn. She calls law enforcement. Law enforcement goes on a search, and they discover that very close to her parents' home, on top of this very high kind of rock that is called the Devil's Teeth, that's sort of over a quarry, an abandoned quarry, they find that the girl is there. Now, she had been eaten by animals out in the elements and was basically bone. And obviously, this hand was still a little bit intact. She was basically skeletonized. And the way she was found, let me be clear, there were some sticks around her in a square shape, and there were some little twigs that had gone into cross shapes around her, right? She's on her belly. She's completely clothed except her shoes. And what happens is when they're looking at the remains, what they said was it was really impossible to say what happened to her. There was no evidence that they could come up with, because if she was skeletonized, of what had happened to her, but they strongly suspected that she had been strangled to death. And interestingly, there were stains on her panties and bra, but in 1972, they weren't able to do too much with them. But there was a suspicion there was a sexual component to this. And the really weird thing to come out of the autopsy was that there was a very high level of lead in her body, which nobody has ever been able to explain. Now, what happened is, in this case, that we would today think, boy, that looks like sexual homicide, right? What happened is that the press and the public started inflating this story like a game of telephone, where before you know it, the square around her was transformed into a pentagram. The everything about it was witchy. She was targeted by witches or Satanists because she was so religious. The lead, it was related to witchcraft or cult activity, because of the witches use it in their services. Although as somebody who has extensively studied cult activity and witchcraft and all this stuff as it relates to crime, the only thing that I could find is that there is a thing called, it's very hard to pronounce it, molybdency, which is a phenomenon where lead is melted, and then you look at the random shape of it as part of divination. But as far as like putting it inside a body, I cannot find any way to tie that. Anyway, so what wound up happening was they interpreted this as having something to do with witchcraft. It's not a coincidence. She's on the Devil's Teeth, religious kid, the whole thing. And from this point on, you wind up getting a blindness to possible linkage to other local sexual homicides. Sure enough, 2 years later, there are two girls, a 17-year-old named Marianne Pryor and a 16-year-old named, I think, Lorraine Kelly, about 22.9 miles away, I calculated, are found dead. They were, I think, strangled, raped, and drowned. They had been kept alive for 3 days in a kind of a sadistic way. And it turns out decades later that a confession comes that they were killed by Richard Cottingham, the serial killer Richard Cottingham, who's known to have had about, at least, I think it was something like 18 victims. He seems to always be confessing to something else. He's still alive. But so that what you had there was a kind of sexual homicide that's happening about less than 25 miles away from where DePalma is found. But because of these culty elements, they've never been able to move past people interpreting it that way. And it led to this kind of unfortunate missing that she should have been looked at as potentially being another case linked to those other two local murders. And the reason I tell this is almost as a cautionary tale for the danger of injecting into a story this kind of culty stuff, because then you become blind. I wonder what people's thoughts are on this. It's such a fascinating case, never been solved. The family has never gotten closure on it. But I think the first thing we would think of today was that this was a sexual homicide. So I'm just curious, what do you guys think? Chris, Ann, Barbara, thoughts on this? Certainly you see the parallels with Delphi.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think? And especially, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Oh, yes, I see. Somebody's mic is on. I certainly see a parallel with the Delphis here as things getting out of hand. And I like your analogy to telephone. Everybody keeps exaggerating. The story gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So that I would agree very much to that. I think that it's as we gain information and knowledge into sexual homicide, when we don't have a motive, you always go to sexual homicide. And it doesn't have to even, we've got cases where the offender will masturbate afterwards, nowhere near the victim. So you never even get to see anything that you can say is evidence of sexual homicide. So I would agree. I think that there's much more to look at now that we've seen some of the beginning of a crime scene. At least the defense has put a few sticks around, and that's my take on it. I don't know, Barbara, Chris.
Well, but Ann, on the DePalma case, the DePalma case that was just presented, I think we have to put into context that this was 1972, before BSU is even talking about, sexual homicide or anything like that. And I also need to add to the story, before you interpret, that the other two victims, the Cottingham confessed victims, were 16 and 17, and were also pretty, young, pretty girls that had the similar hairstyle to DePalma. They were similar, I think, really in size and appearance and all of that. And I just think there are a lot of things there that, like, let's say the Cold Case Foundation that we're on the expert panel were to go in and take a look. I feel like we would pretty immediately be concerned that this was a sexual homicide, and that all of these sort of seeming culty things might be a red herring. But I'm curious, I mean, and any thoughts on that weird crime scene with all the sticks and the square around her and all that stuff?
Yeah, I think that it doesn't sound like a ritual, certainly. Is this Cottingham? Has he been asked about the DePalma case?
Not that I'm aware of, but he was absolutely in fact, he claims 100 murders.
Well,
but he's very, very prolific. Yeah, very prolific.
Where's he out of?
New York, and New Jersey. In fact, that some people called him the Times Square killer or the torso killer. It was also kind of diverse in how he killed. But what he confessed was that he kept these two girls alive for 3 days, sexually tortured them, and drowned them ultimately before they were dumped.
Yeah, well, I'm also the Delphi murders. I think that there's a brook there. The idea, we've certainly seen drownings used, or that being part of the ritual. I'm not convinced that they were killed right away. They could have kept the two girls for a while and carried out something. From what Barbara's described, it's an area that nobody necessarily is going to be visiting, so that there is privacy, so to speak. I don't know on the DePalma. I think that's a really interesting one, where it sounds much more like a serial killer. I see what this Richard Cunningham was doing, Lovingham, whatever his name is. Yeah, I'll have to look.
Yes, I'd sure love to talk to him about it. Chris, what would your thoughts be on that DePalma case? Does it jump out to you as looking serial killer like?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely, because you have the victimology, right? You have two other victims in the geographic region nearby. And, I think if you went into the jail right now, into the prison right now, and started talking to him about it, he's still in prison, right, Gary? Right?
Yeah.
Dimes to donuts, he may be your guy It'd be interesting to hear what he says. So when we do a compare and contrast from an investigative aspect, if we look at the geographic region, I think we're all in agreement here. That suspect is very familiar with that crime scene, that area where, I mean, this guy just didn't show up and, decide, hey, I'm going to, take him to a place that I've never been to before. So that tells me that individual is very familiar with the area. He's probably a local individual. And now we add the elements of the control mechanisms, i.e., the gun, potentially. We add the manner of death, i.e., the throat. Okay. We take the age of the victims and the control mechanisms that the suspect utilized by, in my opinion, I think he stripped them both down and then redressed Abby or had her redress herself. That wouldn't be uncommon. And you commented about that early on. And so I don't think this is, a group of organized offenders who say, okay, today at such and such date, you're going to get these girls down to the bridge. Okay. We're going to be waiting under the bridge. We're going to have all of these instruments of a sacrifice ready to go. Okay. We're going to pull this off and we're going to add a sexual component to it. And then simultaneously, we're going to, put all these Nordic ruins on top of this victim. Okay. And then later on, when they get Alan in jail, we're going to go to the jail system and have patches of Odin on our uniforms and say, look, buddy, if you've done this murder, you're going to confess to it or we're taking everybody else out in the family. Okay. The odds of that happening, tonight there's $1 billion lottery going in California. Okay. Get down there and buy $20 worth of tickets. Okay. So that's my opinion. I don't see this Odinism stuff. I think it's a smokescreen, and rightfully so. That I think the elephant's in the living room. We have a circle of individuals. Now, can I say definitively that Alan's their guy? No. Tonight, I don't have enough information to say definitively Alan's their guy. Could I say that Ron Logan can be taken out of the circle? I wouldn't take him out of the circle. I'd say there needs to be a little more clarity of focus there. And so that's my 2 cents. Barbara?
No, I absolutely agree. And unfortunately, in this case, it seems like every time a couple of documents come out, people are like, see, it is Richard Allen. He absolutely is the killer. I also haven't seen anything yet that tells me beyond a reasonable doubt that he is the guy. Perhaps if we get to trial, we will see that information and perhaps our minds will be changed. But for now, he is innocent until he's proven guilty. And, an unspent shell casing that perhaps matches the ejection marks and his statement, I don't feel like right now is enough to say this is the guy. And, the same with this Odinistic white nationalist group. The defense put this story out. Their job is to deflect and take attention away from their client. They have done that in a spectacular way. And I don't think that there's anything contained in that document that proves that story either. So we are still in a place where there are allegations against a bunch of different people. And until we get to see that evidence and see it picked apart and hear what experts from both sides have to say about it, I'm reserving judgment.
Awesome. Dr. Gary?
I'll just add that, part of the cautionary tale from the DePalma case is really that, and right on time for Halloween, I guess, I'm saying this, but there is this tendency to kind of inject a preternatural evil quality into crimes and to think something dark and sinister and witchy and diabolical or whatever has to be there. But it's much simpler. I mean, Occam's razor, right? Much simpler that what we're dealing with is I hate to say it, a kind of garden variety sexual homicide, which is a much simpler explanation than some kind of elaborate cult activity. And just because it confuses us and it's mysterious doesn't mean we have to go to things that are otherworldly or kind of magical or bizarre. It's probably much simpler than that. So, and my concern is, and I think this is the danger of the DePalma, I like to call the DePalma phenomenon, is the idea that once you inject that stuff and it's in the public's mind, it's very difficult to backtrack and then see it in a more simple way. And then you're in danger of a case collapsing or, going down in history as being something it isn't. So what I'm really concerned about is that where we may be losing our focus on what this was probably really about. And in a way, it minimizes what they went through, what they probably experienced. I mean, I don't know too many ritualistic murders that would be as cruel and as sexualized as this probably was. And just to add in there, one thing I have heard, and I love Barbara's thoughts on this, but I heard that part of the way of justifying why Odinists might want to do this or something, I heard some kind of story about one of the girls coming from a mixed race family. Have you heard anything about that, or is that again the game of telephone that seems to erupt from these kinds of stories?
I'm not aware of that existing in either family.
Neither am
Certainly
I. So I think
possible,
it's
but
right.
and if it is, it's certainly not a very forward aspect of either girl's life. Their immediate families were all also white.
I think it's a myth, but I have seen somebody even say it in the comments here tonight. So I wanted to make sure we addressed it. That if you haven't heard it,
Yeah,
don't
in this case, there's been so much online speculation that there are a lot of rumors and speculation from random people that have kind of taken on a life of their own, and many people believe, which is another reason why I'm really excited for a trial to see what do they have that they can prove, that we can see and learn how it was evaluated and by who and all of that, because there's just been so much rumor and innuendo.
Yeah, and that's why the DePalma case, I think, to your point, Barbara, is so important to consider, just from even an objective position. It can happen rapidly where this information gets to a place where it takes a life of it, takes on a life of its own, and next thing you know it, the only person and persons being victimized are the victims and their families. And this is why I have such great guests, and and in the Cold Case Foundation, we're very careful about when we present stuff like this, and that we just kind of remain agnostic, for lack of a better term, until all of the evidence is presented in a court of law. And you're right, he is presumed innocent until a jury makes that decision. And until that time, you have the most information of anybody we could find. And for that, we are so grateful for your time here tonight. And as you know, we have a tradition here. So you're going to have the last word here. But I'm going to give some time to, we're going to start with Dr. Burgess, because my mother would never forgive me if I didn't go ladies first. And then Dr. Brucato, and then I'm going to drop out, and you're going to have the final word, and we're going to go to Hawaii. Okay.
All right.
Okay. But one other thought here. There is a question. It says, could there be two killers because she was nude dressed? Anybody want to weigh in on that one?
I think it would be hard to have two and not have more information at this point. Usually with two, you try to get one to go against the other. Well, I don't know whether they've had that. So, of course there could be. I mean, anything is possible, but I would stick more with it's one. I don't know, Gary.
Okay, if anybody has not,
I think it's one. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, if anybody's not bought their books yet or listened to Down the Hill, we've got 20 million downloads of Down the Hill. Make it 25 million. Get down there. We've had 3,000 people watching us in the last hour. So it's a very productive evening. So Dr. Burgess, what say you in the last couple of minutes?
The last couple of minutes, I want to thank Barbara MacDonald. That's one of the most fascinating presentations I've heard. You did it quickly, eloquently, and I just really appreciated it. And I think it does point out what hit me the most is you've got two young girls, to somebody that takes that as his way of, I think it's male, no question, same race, all of the similar profiles I'm sure you've done, and has given us another example to have to look at. And I think Gary giving us the information on that Janette DePalma case was fascinating. So I've learned a lot tonight, and I thank everyone for this, and I hope your audience too. So great evening.
From the legend. And thank you so much. Gary, what say you?
Well, I just think it's important to pause and, as I always say, just pause a moment and kind of realize that what we're talking about here are two young girls who were filled with potential and kindness and were really beloved, and what it really looks like more and more had their lives snuffed out because of some angry, woman-hating, nasty guy needing to express that, and play out some kind of sexually perverse fantasies. And the idea that these were human beings that then, in addition to that, have their photos splashed all over the media 24/7, people sitting around speculating about their final moments, and all this kind of thing. It's just, the whole thing it adds to the horror of what was done, and it adds to the victimization like a pebble thrown into the water, and you just see these ripple effects on the families and the culture and the community and the whole thing. And I just think we have to pause a moment and say, like, the only reason we're talking about these awful people is to try to prevent one more person from ever having to go through that, and a family from ever having to go through that. And that is exactly why it's so sad to think that because of a lot of problems in this investigation and so forth, that every day it just feels, like when the kids play hide and go seek, we're getting colder and colder. And I just think the case may go cold, and that's just so sad for the family. So I just hope justice comes, and that we remember those kids in our hearts.
Well said. Barbara, you have the final moment here, and thank you so very much for coming on tonight.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. The honor is all mine. And, I think, like Dr. Brucato was just saying, the final word here is Abby and Libby. This is about these two wonderful little girls who just went out for an afternoon to take a walk in the woods and take some pictures for social media and have a good time. And they were loved. They both come from families that just loved and adored them and provided for them. And they did not deserve what happened to them. They didn't do anything to cause what happened to them. And, thanks to Libby's quick thinking, we have the video of the suspect. I hope that it's helpful in convicting whoever it is that's responsible for this horrible crime. And if that is Richard Allen and he acted alone, I certainly hope he's convicted and receives a suitable punishment for what happened. Nothing can bring these girls back. Their families will miss them terribly forever. There are holes in both families where these girls once existed. But these girls, I relate so much to them. They were just out having a good time in the middle of the day on a Monday afternoon. They were together. They were having a good time, and this should not have happened to them. And so I think we should all, those of us who follow the case on social media, should all be dedicated to protecting the conviction of whoever it is that did this. And right now, Richard Allen is charged. If he's the guy, let's get him convicted and punished.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.